He began to laugh uproariously. "Wasn't it a blast?" he said, still trying to sound like an American. "Figures in front of a mirror is only the foreplay. What a thing! What a thing!" The first time I'd mentioned the story to Don Juan, I had told him that I'd been deeply affected by the haunting melody and the old prostitute clumsily twirling to the music. And I had been deeply affected also by the realization of how callous my friend was. When I'd finished retelling my story to Don Juan, as we sat in the hills of a range of mountains in Sonora, I was shaken, mysteriously affected by something quite undefined. "That story," Don Juan said, "should go in your album of memorable events. Your friend, without having any idea of what he was doing, gave you, as he himself said, something that will indeed last you for a lifetime." "I see this as a sad story, Don Juan, but that's all," I declared. "It's indeed a sad story, just like your other stories," Don Juan replied. "But what makes it different and memorable to me is that it touches every one of us human beings, not just you, like your other tales. You see, like Madame Ludmilla, every one of us, young and old alike, is making figures in front of a mirror in one way or another. Tally what you know about people. Think of any human being on this earth, and you will know, without the shadow of a doubt, that no matter who they are, or what they think of themselves, or what they do, the result of their actions is always the same. Senseless figures in front of a mirror." A tremor in the air. A journey of power. At the time I met Don Juan, I was a fairly studious anthropology student, and I wanted to begin my career as a professional anthropologist by publishing as much as possible. I was bent on climbing the academic ladder, and in my calculations, I determined that the first step was to collect data on the uses of medicinal plants by the Indians of the southwestern United States. I first asked a professor of anthropology who had worked in that area for advice about my project. He was a prominent ethnologist who had published extensively in the late 30s and early 40s on the California Indians and the Indians of the Southwest and Sonora, Mexico. He patiently listened to my exposition. My idea was to write a paper, call it Ethnobotanical Data, and publish it in a journal that dealt exclusively with anthropological issues of the southwestern United States. I proposed to collect medicinal plants, take the samples to the Botanical Garden at UCLA to be properly identified, and then describe why and how the Indians of the Southwest used them. I envisioned collecting thousands of entries. I even envisioned publishing a small encyclopedia on the subject. The professor smiled forgivingly at me. "I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm," he said in a tired voice, "but I can't help commenting negatively on your eagerness. Eagerness is welcome in anthropology, but it must be properly channeled. We're still in the golden age of anthropology. It was my luck to study with Alfred Kroeber and Robert Lowy, two pillars of social science. I haven't betrayed their trust. Anthropology is still the master discipline. Every other discipline should stem from anthropology. The entire field of history, for example, should be called historical anthropology, and the field of philosophy should be called philosophical anthropology. Man should be the measure of everything. Therefore, anthropology, the study of man, should be the core of every other discipline. Someday, it will." I looked at him, bewildered. He was, in my estimation, a totally passive, benevolent old professor who had recently had a heart attack. I seemed to have struck a chord of passion. "Don't you think that you should pay more attention to your formal studies?" he continued. "Rather than doing field work, wouldn't it be better for you to study linguistics? We have in the department here one of the most prominent linguists in the world. If I were you, I'd be sitting at his feet, catching any drift emanating from him. We also have a superb authority in comparative religions, and there are some exceptionally competent anthropologists here who have done work on kinship systems in cultures all over the world from the point of view of linguistics and from the point of view of cognition. You need a lot of preparation. To think that you could do field work now is a travesty. Plunge into your books, young man. That's my advice. Stubbornly, I took my proposition to another professor, a younger one. He wasn't in any way more helpful. He laughed at me openly. He told me that the paper I wanted to write was a Mickey Mouse paper, and that it wasn't anthropology by any stretch of the imagination. Anthropologists nowadays, he said professorially, are concerned with issues that have relevance. Medical and pharmaceutical scientists have done endless research on every possible medicinal plant in the world. There's no longer any bone to chew on there. Your kind of data collecting belongs to the turn of the 19th century. Now it's nearly 200 years later. There is such a thing as progress, you know. He proceeded to give me, then, a definition and a justification of progress and perfectibility as two issues of philosophical discourse, which he said were most relevant to anthropology. Anthropology is the only discipline in existence, he continued, which can clearly substantiate the concept of perfectibility and progress. Thank God that there's still a ray of hope in the midst of the cynicism of our times. Only anthropology can show the actual development of culture and social organization. Only anthropologists can prove to mankind beyond the shadow of a doubt the progress of human knowledge. Culture evolves, and only anthropologists can present samples of society that fit definite cubbyholes in a line of progress and perfectibility. That's anthropology for you, not some puny fieldwork, which is not fieldwork at all, but mere masturbation. It was a blow on the head to me. As a last resort, I went to Arizona to talk to anthropologists who were actually doing fieldwork there. By then, I was ready to give up on the whole idea. I understood what the two professors were trying to tell me. I couldn't have agreed with them more. My attempts at doing fieldwork were definitely simple-minded, yet I wanted to get my feet wet in the field. I didn't want to do only library research. In Arizona, I met with an extremely seasoned anthropologist who had written copiously on the Yaqui Indians of Arizona as well as those of Sonora, Mexico. He was extremely kind. He didn't run me down, nor did he give me any advice. He only commented that the Indian societies of the Southwest were extremely isolationist, and that foreigners, especially those of Hispanic origin, were distrusted, even abhorred by those Indians. A younger colleague of his, however, was more outspoken. He said that I was better off reading herbalists' books. He was an authority in the field, and his opinion was that anything to be known about medicinal plants from the Southwest had already been classified and talked about in various publications. He went as far as to say that the sources of any Indian curer of the day were precisely those publications, rather than any traditional knowledge. He finished me off with the assertion that if there still were any traditional curing practices, the Indians would not divulge them to a stranger. Do something worthwhile, he advised me. Look into urban anthropology. There's a lot of money for studies on alcoholism among Indians in the big city, for example. Now that's something that any anthropologist can do easily. Go and get drunk with local Indians in a bar. Then arrange whatever you find about them in terms of statistics. Turn everything into numbers. Urban anthropology is a real field. There was nothing else for me to do except to take the advice of those experienced social scientists. I decided to fly back to Los Angeles. But another anthropologist friend of mine let me know then that he was going to drive through Arizona and New Mexico. visiting all the places where he'd done work in the past, renewing in this fashion his relationships with the people who had been his anthropological informants. "You're welcome to come with me," he said. "I'm not going to do any work. I'm just going to visit with them, have a few drinks with them, bullshit with them. I bought gifts for them. Blankets, booze, jackets, ammunition for .22 caliber rifles. My car is loaded with goodies. I usually drive alone whenever I go to see them, but by myself I always run the risk of falling asleep. You could keep me company, keep me from dozing off, or drive a little bit if I'm too drunk." I felt so despondent that I turned him down. "I'm very sorry, Bill," I said. "The trip won't do for me. I see no point in pursuing this idea of fieldwork any longer." "Don't give up without a fight," Bill said in a tone of paternal concern. "Give all you have to the fight, and if it licks you, then it's okay to give up. But not before. Come with me and see how you like the Southwest." He put his arm around my shoulders. I couldn't help noticing how immensely heavy his arm was. He was tall and husky, but in recent years his body had acquired a strange rigidity. He'd lost his boyish quality. His round face was no longer filled, youthful, the way it had been. Now it was a worried face. I believed that he worried because he was losing his hair, but at times it seemed to me that it was something more than that. And it wasn't that he was fatter. His body was heavy in ways that were impossible to explain. I noticed it in the way that he walked and got up and sat down. Bill seemed to me to be fighting gravity with every fiber of his being in everything he did. Disregarding my feelings of defeat, I started on a journey with him. We visited every place in Arizona and New Mexico where there were Indians. One of the end results of this trip was that I found out that my anthropologist friend had two definite facets to his person. He explained to me that his opinions as a professional anthropologist were very measured and congruous with the anthropological thought of the day, but that, as a private person, his anthropological fieldwork had given him a wealth of experiences that he never talked about. These experiences were not congruous with the anthropological thought of the day because they were events that were impossible to catalog. During the course of our trip, he would invariably have some drinks with his ex-informants and feel very relaxed afterward. I would take the wheel then and drive as he sat in the passenger seat, taking sips from his bottle of 30-year-old Ballantine. It was then that Bill would talk about his uncatalogued experiences. "I've never believed in ghosts," he said abruptly one day. "I never went in for apparitions and floating essences. Voices in the dark, you know. I had a very pragmatic, serious upbringing. Science has always been my compass. But then, in the field, all kinds of weird crap began to filter through to me. For instance, I went with some Indians one night on a vision quest. They were going to actually initiate me by some painful business of piercing the muscles of my chest. They were preparing a sweat lodge in the woods. I'd resigned myself to withstand the pain. I took a couple of drinks to give me strength. And then, the man who was going to intercede for me with the people who actually performed the ceremony yelled in horror and pointed at a dark, shadowy figure walking toward us. When the shadowy figure came closer to me, Bill went on, I noticed that what I had in front of me was an old Indian dressed in the weirdest getup you could imagine. He had the paraphernalia of shamans. The man I was with that night fainted shamelessly at the sight of the old man. The old man came to me and pointed a finger at my chest. His finger was just skin and bone. He babbled incomprehensible things to me. By then, the rest of the people had seen the old man and started to rush silently toward me. The old man turned to look at them, and every one of them froze. He harangued them for a moment. His voice was something unforgettable. It was as if he were talking from a tube, or as if he had something attached to his mouth that carried the words out of him. I swear to you that I saw the man talking inside his body, and his mouth broadcasting the words as a mechanical apparatus. After haranguing the men, the old man continued walking, past me, past them, and disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Bill said that the plan to have an initiation ceremony went to pot. It was never performed, and the men, including the shamans in charge, were shaking in their boots. He stated that they were so frightened that they disbanded and left. People who had been friends for years, he went on, never spoke to each other again. They claimed that what they'd seen was the apparition of an incredibly old shaman, and that it would bring bad luck to talk about it among themselves. In fact, they said that the mere act of setting eyes on one another would bring them bad luck. Most of them moved away from the area. Why did they feel that talking to each other or seeing each other would bring them bad luck? I asked him. Those are their beliefs, he replied. A vision of that nature means to them that the apparition spoke to each of them individually. To have a vision of that nature is for them the luck of a lifetime. And what was the individual thing that the vision told each of them? I asked. Beats me, he replied. They never explained anything to me. Every time I asked them, they entered into a profound state of numbness. They hadn't seen anything, they hadn't heard anything. Years after the event, the man who had fainted next to me swore to me that he had just faked the faint because he was so frightened that he didn't want to face the old man, and that what he had to say was understood by everybody at a level other than language comprehension. Bill said that in his case, what the apparition voiced to him he understood as having to do with his health and his expectations in life. What do you mean by that? I asked him. Things are not that good for me, he confessed. My body doesn't feel well. But do you know what is really the matter with you? I asked. Oh, yes, he said nonchalantly. Doctors have told me, but I'm not going to worry about it, or even think about it. Bill's revelations left me feeling thoroughly uneasy. This was a facet of his person that I didn't know. I'd always thought that he was a tough old cookie. I could never conceive of him as vulnerable. I didn't like our exchange. It was, however, too late for me to retreat. Our trip continued. On another occasion, he confided that the shamans of the Southwest were capable of transforming themselves into different entities, and that the categorization schemes of bear shaman or mountain lion shaman, etc., should not be taken as euphemisms or metaphors, because they were not. Would you believe it, he said in a tone of great admiration, that there are some shamans who actually become bear, or mountain lion, or eagles? I'm not exaggerating, nor am I fabricating anything when I say that once I witnessed the transformation of a shaman who called himself Riverman, or River Shaman, or proceeding from river, returning to river. I was out in the mountains of New Mexico with this shaman. I was driving for him. He trusted me, and he was going in search of his origin, or so he said. We were walking along a river when he suddenly got very excited. He told me to move away from the shore to some high rocks and hide there, put a blanket over my head and shoulders, and peek through it so I wouldn't miss what he was about to do. What was he going to do? I asked him, incapable of containing myself. I didn't know, he said. Your guess would have been as good as mine. I had no way of conceiving of what he was going to do. He just walked into the water, fully dressed. When the water reached him at mid-calf, because it was a wide but shallow river, the shaman simply vanished, disappeared. Prior to entering the water, he'd whispered in my ear that I should go downstream and wait for him. He told me the exact spot to wait. I, of course, didn't believe a word of what he was saying, so at first I couldn't remember where he'd said I had to wait for him. But then I found the spot, and I saw the shaman coming out of the water. It sounds stupid to say coming out of the water. I saw a shaman turning into water and then being remade out of the water. Can you believe that? I had no comments on his stories. It was impossible for me to believe it, but I couldn't disbelieve him either. He was a very serious man. The only possible explanation that I could think of was that as we continued our trip, he drank more and more every day. He had, in the trunk of the car, a box of 24 bottles of scotch for only himself. He actually drank like a fish. I've always been partial to the esoteric mutations of shamans, he said to me another day. It's not that I can explain the mutations, or even believe that they take place, but as an intellectual exercise, I'm very interested in considering that mutations into snakes and mountain lions are not as difficult as what the water shaman did. It's at moments like this when I engage my intellect in such a fashion that I cease to be an anthropologist and I begin to react, following a gut feeling. My gut feeling is that those shamans certainly do something that can't be measured scientifically or even talked about intelligently. For instance, there are cloud shamans who turn into clouds, into mist. I've never seen this happen, but I knew a cloud shaman. I never saw him disappearing or turning into mist in front of my eyes as I saw that other shaman turning into water right in front of me. But I chased that cloud shaman one day, and he simply vanished in an area where there was no place for him to hide. Although I didn't see him turning into a cloud, he disappeared. Couldn't explain where he went. There were no rocks or vegetation around the place where he ended up. I was there half a minute after he was. The shaman was gone. I chased that man all over the place for information, Bill went on. He wouldn't give me the time of day. He was very friendly to me, but that was all. Bill told me endless other stories about strife and political factions among Indians in different Indian reservations, or stories about personal vendettas, animosities, friendships, etc., which didn't interest me in the least. On the other hand, his stories about shamans' mutations and apparitions had caused a true emotional upheaval. I was at once both fascinated and appalled by them. However, when I tried to think about why I was fascinated or appalled, I couldn't tell. All I could have said was that his stories about shamans hit me at an unknown, visceral level. Another realization brought by this trip was that I verified for myself that the Indian societies of the Southwest were indeed closed to outsiders. I finally came to accept that I did need a great deal of preparation in the science of anthropology, and that it was more functional to do anthropological fieldwork in an area with which I was familiar, or one in which I had an entree. When the journey ended, Bill drove me to the Greyhound bus depot in Nogales, Arizona, for my return trip to Los Angeles. As we were sitting in the waiting area before the bus came, he consoled me in a paternal manner, reminding me that failures were a matter of course in anthropological fieldwork, and that they meant only the hardening of one's purpose, or the coming to maturity of an anthropologist. Abruptly, he leaned over and pointed with a slight movement of his chin to the other side of the room. I think that old man sitting on the bench by the corner over there is the man I told you about, he whispered in my ear. I'm not quite sure because I've had him in front of me, face to face, only once. What man is that? What did you tell me about him? I asked. When we were talking about the shamans and shamans' transformations, I told you that I'd once met a cloud shaman. Yes, I remember that, I said. Is that man the cloud shaman? No, he said emphatically. But I think he is a companion or a teacher of the cloud shaman. Saw both of them together in the distance various times, many years ago. I did remember Bill mentioning in a very casual manner, but not in relation to the cloud shaman, that he knew about the existence of a mysterious old man who was a retired shaman, an old Indian misanthrope from Yuma, who had once been a terrifying sorcerer. The relationship of the old man to the cloud shaman was never voiced by my friend, but obviously it was foremost in Bill's mind, to the point where he believed that he'd told me about it. A strange anxiety suddenly possessed me and made me jump out of my seat. As if I had no volition of my own, I approached the old man and immediately began a long tirade on how much I knew about medicinal plants and shamanism among the American Indians of the plains and their Siberian ancestors. As a secondary theme, I mentioned to the old man that I knew that he was a shaman. I concluded by assuring him that it would be thoroughly beneficial for him to talk to me at length. If nothing else, I said petulantly, we could swap stories. You tell me yours and I'll tell you mine. The old man kept his eyes lowered until the last moment. Then he peered at me. I am Juan Matus, he said, looking me squarely in the eyes. My tirade shouldn't have ended by any means, but for no reason that I could discern, I felt that there was nothing more I could have said. I wanted to tell him my name. He raised his hand to the height of my lips as if to prevent me from saying it. At that instant, a bus pulled up to the bus stop. The old man muttered that it was the bus he had to take. Then he earnestly asked me to look him up so we could talk with more ease and swap stories. There was an ironic smirk on the corner of his mouth when he said that. With an incredible agility for a man his age, I figured he must have been in his 80s, he covered in a few leaps the 50 yards between the bench where he was sitting and the door of the bus. As if the bus had stopped just to pick him up, it moved away as soon as he had jumped in and the door had closed. After the old man left, I went back to the bench where Bill was sitting. "What did he say? What did he say?" he asked excitedly. "He told me to look him up and come to his house to visit," I said. "He even said that we could talk there." "But what did you say to him to get him to invite you to his house?" he demanded. I told Bill that I had used my best sales pitch and that I had promised the old man to reveal to him everything I knew from the point of view of my reading about medicinal plants. Bill, obviously, didn't believe me. He accused me of holding out on him. "I know the people around this area," he said belligerently. "And that old man is a very strange fart. He doesn't talk to anybody, Indians included. Why would he talk to you, a perfect stranger? You're not even cute." It was obvious that Bill was annoyed with me. I couldn't figure out why, though. I didn't dare ask him for an explanation. He gave me the impression of being a bit jealous. Perhaps he felt that I had succeeded where he had failed. However, my success had been so inadvertent that it didn't mean anything to me. Except for Bill's casual remarks, I didn't have any conception of how difficult it was to approach that old man, and I couldn't have cared less. At the time, I found nothing remarkable in the exchange. It baffled me that Bill was so upset about it. "Do you know where his house is?" I asked him. "I haven't the foggiest idea," he answered curtly. "I've heard people from this area say that he doesn't live anywhere, that he just appears here and there unexpectedly. That's a lot of horse shit. He probably lives in some shack in Nogales, Mexico." "Why is he so important?" I asked him. My question made me gather enough courage to add, "You seem to be upset because he talked to me. Why?" Without any ado, he admitted that he was chagrined because he knew how useless it was to try to talk to that man. "That old man is as rude as anyone can be," he added. "At best, he stares at you without saying a word when you talk to him. At other times, he doesn't even look at you. He treats you as if you didn't exist. The one time I tried to talk to him, he brutally turned me down. You know what he said to me? He said, 'If I were you, I wouldn't waste my energy opening my mouth. Save it. You need it. If he weren't such an old fart, I would have punched him in the nose. I pointed out to Bill that to call him an old man was more a figure of speech than an actual description. He didn't really appear to be that old, although he was definitely old. He possessed a tremendous vigor and agility. I felt that Bill would have failed miserably if he had tried to punch him in the nose. That old Indian was powerful. In fact, he was downright scary. I didn't voice my thoughts. I let Bill go on telling me how disgusted he was at the nastiness of that old man, and how he would have dealt with him had it not been for the fact that the old man was so feeble. Who do you think could give me some information about where he might live? I asked him. Perhaps some people in Yuma, he replied, a bit more relaxed. Maybe the people I introduced you to at the beginning of our trip. You wouldn't lose anything by asking them. Tell them that I sent you to them. I changed my plans right then. Instead of going back to Los Angeles, went directly to Yuma, Arizona. I saw the people to whom Bill had introduced me. They didn't know where the old Indian lived, but their comments about him inflamed my curiosity even more. They said that he wasn't from Yuma, but from Sonora, Mexico, and that in his youth he had been a fearsome sorcerer who did incantations and put spells on people, but that he had mellowed with age, turning into an ascetic hermit. They remarked that although he was a Yaqui Indian, he had once run around with a group of Mexican men who seemed to be extremely knowledgeable about bewitching practices. They all agreed that they hadn't seen those men in the area for ages. One of the men added that the old man was contemporaneous with his grandfather, but that while his grandfather was senile and bedridden, the sorcerer seemed to be more vigorous than ever. The same man referred me to some people in Hermosillo, the capital of Sonora, who might know the old man and be able to tell me more about him. The prospect of going to Mexico was not at all appealing to me. Sonora was too far away from my area of interest. Besides, I reasoned that I was better off doing urban anthropology after all, and I went back to Los Angeles. But before leaving for Los Angeles, I canvassed the area of Yuma, searching for information about the old man. No one knew anything about him. As the bus drove to Los Angeles, I experienced a unique sensation. On the one hand, I felt totally cured of my obsession with fieldwork or my interest in the old man. On the other hand, I felt a strange nostalgia. It was, truthfully, something I'd never felt before. Its newness struck me profoundly. It was a mixture of anxiety and longing, as if I were missing something of tremendous importance. I had the clear sensation as I approached Los Angeles that whatever had been acting on me around Yuma had begun to fade with distance, but its fading only increased my unwarranted longing. The intent of infinity. I want you to think deliberately about every detail of what transpired between you and those two men, Jorge Campos and Lucas Coronado, Don Juan said to me, who are the ones who really delivered you to me. Then, tell me all about it. I found his request very difficult to fulfill, and yet I actually enjoyed remembering everything those two had said to me. He wanted every detail possible, something that forced me to push my memory to its limits. The story Don Juan wanted me to recollect began in the city of Guaymas, in Sonora, Mexico. In Yuma, Arizona, I'd been given the names and addresses of some people who, I was told, might be able to shed light on the mystery of the old man I'd met in the bus depot. The people I went to see not only didn't know any retired old shaman, they even doubted that such a man had ever existed. They were all filled to the brim, however, with scary stories about Yaqui shamans and about the belligerent general mood of the Yaqui Indians. They insinuated that perhaps in Vica, a railroad station town between the cities of Guaymas and Ciudad Obregón, I might find someone who could perhaps steer me in the proper direction. Is there anyone in particular I could look up? I asked. Your best bet would be to talk to a field inspector or the official government bank, one of the men suggested. The bank has a lot of field inspectors. They know all the Indians of the area because the bank is the government institution that buys their crops. And every Yaqui is a farmer, the proprietor of a parcel of land that he can call his own as long as he cultivates it. Do you know any field inspectors? I asked. They looked at each other and smiled apologetically at me. They didn't know any, but strongly recommended that I should approach one of those men on my own and put my case to him. In Vicam Station, my attempts at making contact with the field inspectors of the government bank were a total disaster. I met 3 of them, and when I told them what I wanted, every one of them looked at me with utter distrust. They immediately suspected that I was a spy sent there by the Yankees to cause problems that they could not clearly define, but about which they made wild speculations ranging from political agitation to industrial espionage. It was the unsubstantiated belief of everyone around that there were copper deposits in the lands of the Yaqui Indians and that the Yankees coveted them. After this resounding failure, I retreated to the city of Guaymas and stayed at a hotel that was very close to a fabulous restaurant. I went there 3 times a day. The food was superb. I liked it so much that I stayed in Guaymas for over a week. I practically lived in the restaurant and became, in this manner, acquainted with the owner, Mr. Reyes. One afternoon while I was eating, Mr. Reyes came to my table with another man whom he introduced to me as Jorge Campos, a full-blooded Yaqui Indian entrepreneur who'd lived in Arizona in his youth, who spoke English perfectly and who was more American than any American. Mr. Reyes praised him as a true example of how hard work and dedication could develop a person into an exceptional man. Mr. Reyes left, and Jorge Campos sat down next to me and immediately took over. He pretended to be modest and denied all praise, but it was obvious that he was as pleased as Punch with what Mr. Reyes had said about him. At first sight, I had the clear impression that Jorge Campos was an entrepreneur of the particular kind that one finds in bars or on crowded corners of main streets, trying to sell an idea or simply trying to find a way to con people out of their savings. Mr. Campos was very pleasant looking, around 6 feet tall and lean, but with a high pot belly like a habitual drinker of hard liquor. He had a very dark complexion with a touch of green to it, and wore expensive blue jeans and shiny cowboy boots with pointed toes and angular heels, as if he needed to dig them into the ground to stop being dragged by a lassoed steer. He was wearing an impeccably ironed gray plaid shirt. In its right pocket was a plastic pocket guard into which he had inserted a row of pens. I had seen the same pocket guard among office workers who didn't want to stain their shirt pockets with ink. His attire also included an expensive-looking fringed reddish-brown suede jacket and a tall Texas-style cowboy hat. His round face was expressionless. He had no wrinkles, even though he seemed to be in his early 50s. For some unknown reason, I believed that he was dangerous. "Very pleased to meet you, Mr. Campos," I said in Spanish, extending my hand to him. "Let's dispense with the formalities," he responded, also in Spanish, shaking my hand vigorously. "I like to treat young people as equals, regardless of age differences. Call me Jorge." He was quiet for a moment, no doubt assessing my reaction. I didn't know what to say. I certainly didn't want to humor him, nor did I want to take him seriously. "I'm curious to know what you're doing in Guaymas," he went on casually. "You don't seem to be a tourist, nor do you seem to be interested in deep-sea fishing." "I'm an anthropology student," I said. and I'm trying to establish my credentials with the local Indians in order to do some field research. And I am a businessman, he said. My business is to supply information, to be the go-between. You have the need, I have the commodity. I charge for my services. However, my services are guaranteed. If you don't get satisfaction, you don't have to pay me. If your business is to supply information, I said, I will gladly pay you whatever you charge. Ah, he exclaimed. You certainly need a guide, someone with more education than the average Indian here to show you around. Do you have a grant from the United States government or from another big institution? Yes, I lied. I have a grant from the Esoterical Foundation of Los Angeles. When I said that, I actually saw a glint of greed in his eyes. Ah, he exclaimed again. How big is that institution? Fairly big, I said. My goodness, is that so? He said, as if my words were an explanation that he had wanted to hear. And now, may I ask you, if you don't mind, how big is your grant? How much money did they give you? A few $1,000s to do preliminary field work. I lied again to see what he would say. Ah, I like people who are direct, he said, relishing his words. I am sure that you and I are going to reach an agreement. I offer you my services as a guide and as a key that can open many secret doors among the Yaquis. As you can see by my general appearance, I am a man of taste and means. Oh yes, definitely, you are a man of good taste, I asserted. What I am saying to you, he said, is that for a small fee, which you will find most reasonable, I will steer you to the right people to whom you could ask any question you want. And for some very little more, I will translate their words to you, verbatim, into Spanish or English. I can also speak French and German, but I have the feeling that those languages do not interest you. You are right. You are so very right, I said. Those languages don't interest me at all. But how much would your fees be? Ah, my fees, he said, and took a leather-covered notebook out of his back pocket and flipped it open in front of my face. He scribbled quick notes on it, flipped it closed again, and put it in his pocket with precision and speed. I was sure that he wanted to give me the impression of being efficient and fast at calculating figures. I will charge you $50 a day, he said, with transportation, plus my meals. I mean, when you eat, I eat. What do you say? At that moment, he leaned over to me and almost in a whisper said that we should shift into English because he didn't want people to know the nature of our transaction. He began to speak to me then in something that wasn't English at all. I was at a loss. I didn't know how to respond. I began to fret nervously as the man kept on talking gibberish with the most natural air. He didn't bat an eyelash. He moved his hands in a very animated fashion and pointed around him as if he were instructing me. I didn't have the impression that he was speaking in tongues. I thought perhaps he was speaking the Yaqui language. When people came around to our table and looked at us, I nodded and said to Jorge Campos, yes, indeed. At one point I said, you could say that again. And this sounded so funny to me that I broke into a belly laugh. He also laughed heartily, as if I'd said the funniest thing possible. He must have noticed that I was finally at my wit's end, and before I could get up and tell him to get lost, he started to speak Spanish again. I don't want to tire you with my silly observation, he said. But if I'm going to be your guide, as I think I am going to be, we will be spending long hours chatting. I was testing you just now to see if you are a good conversationalist. If I'm going to spend time with you driving, I need someone by me who could be a good receptor and initiator. I'm glad to tell you that you are both. Then he stood up, shook my hand, and left. As if on cue, the owner came to my table, smiling and shaking his head from side to side like a little bear. "Isn't he a fabulous guy?" he asked me. I didn't want to commit myself to a statement, and Mr. Reyes volunteered that Jorge Campos was at that moment a go-between in an extremely delicate and profitable transaction. He said that some mining companies in the United States were interested in the iron and copper deposits that belonged to the Yaqui Indians, and that Jorge Campos was there, in line to collect perhaps a $5 million fee. I knew then that Jorge Campos was a con man. There were no iron or copper deposits on the lands owned by the Yaqui Indians. If there had been any, private enterprises would have already moved the Yaquis out of those lands and relocated them somewhere else. "He's fabulous," I said. "Most wonderful guy I ever met. How can I get in touch with him again?" "Don't worry about that," Mr. Reyes said. "Jorge asked me all about you. He's been watching you since you came. He'll probably come and knock on your door later today or tomorrow." Mr. Reyes was right. A couple of hours later, somebody woke me from my afternoon nap. It was Jorge Campos. I had intended to leave Guaymas in the early evening and drive all night to California. I explained to him that I was leaving, but that I would come back in a month or so. But you must stay now that I've decided to be your guide," he said. "I'm sorry, but we'll have to wait for this because my time is very limited now," I replied. I knew that Jorge Campos was a crook, yet I decided to reveal to him that I already had an informant who was waiting to work with me, and that I had met him in Arizona. I described the old man and said that his name was Juan Matus, and that other people had characterized him as a shaman. Jorge Campos smiled at me broadly. I asked him if he knew the old man. Yes, I know him," he said jovially. "You may say that we are good friends." Without being invited, Jorge Campos came into the room and sat down at the table just inside the balcony. "Does he live around here?" I asked. "He certainly does," he assured me. "Would you take me to him?" "I don't see why not," he said. "I would need a couple of days to make my own inquiries, just to make sure that he is there, and then we will go and see him." I knew that he was lying, yet I didn't want to believe it. I even thought that my initial distrust had perhaps been ill-founded. He seemed so convincing at that moment. "However," he continued, "in order to take you to see the man, I will charge you a flat fee. My honorarium will be $200. That amount was more than I had at my disposal. I politely declined and said that I didn't have enough money with me. "I don't want to appear mercenary," he said with his most winning smile. "But how much money can you afford? You must take into consideration that I have to do a little bribing. The Yaqui Indians are very private, but there are always ways, there are always doors that open with a magical key. Money." In spite of all my misgivings, I was convinced that Jorge Campos was my entry, not only into the Yaqui world, but to finding the old man who had intrigued me so much. I didn't want to haggle over money. I was almost embarrassed to offer him the $50 I had in my pocket. "I'm at the end of my stay here," I said as a sort of apology. "So I've nearly run out of money. I have only $50 left." Jorge Campos stretched his long legs under the table, crossed his arms behind his head, tipping his hat over his face. "I'll take your $50 and your watch," he said shamelessly. "But for that money, I will take you to meet a miner shaman. Don't get impatient," he warned me, as if I were going to protest. "We must step carefully up the ladder of the lower ranks to the man himself, who, I assure you, is at the very top." "And when can I meet this miner shaman?" I asked, handing him the money and my watch. "Right now," he replied, as he sat up straight and eagerly grabbed the money and the watch. Let's go. There's not a minute to waste. We got into my car, and he directed me to head off for the town of Potam, one of the traditional Yaqui towns along the Yaqui River. As we drove, he revealed to me that we were going to meet Lucas Coronado, a man who was known for his sorcery feats, his shamanistic trances, and for the magnificent masks that he made for the Yaqui festivities of Lent. Then he shifted the conversation to the old man, and what he said was in total contradiction to what others had said to me about the man. While they described him as a hermit and retired shaman, Jorge Campos portrayed him as the most prominent curer and sorcerer of the area, a man whose fame had turned him into a nearly inaccessible figure. He paused like an actor, and then he delivered his blow. He said that to talk to the old man on a steady basis, the way anthropologists like to do, was going to cost me at least $2,000. I was going to protest such a drastic hike in price, but he anticipated. For $200, I could take you to it, he said. Out of those $200, I would clear about $30. The rest would go for bribes. But to talk to him at length cost more. You yourself could figure that out. He has actual bodyguards, people who protect him. I have to sweet-talk them and come up with dough for them. In the end, he continued, I will give you a total account with receipts and everything for your taxes. Then you'll know that my commission for setting it all up is minimal. I felt a wave of admiration for him. He was aware of everything, even receipts for income tax. He was quiet for a while, as if calculating his minimal profit. I had nothing to say. I was busy calculating myself, trying to figure out a way to get $2,000. I even thought of really applying for a grant. But are you sure the old man would talk to me? I asked. Of course, he assured me. Not only would he talk to you, he's going to perform sorcery for you, for what you pay him. Then you could work out an agreement with him as to how much you could pay him for further lessons. Jorge Campos kept silent again for a while, peering into my eyes. Do you think that you could pay me the $2,000? He asked in a tone so purposefully indifferent that I instantly knew it was a sham. Oh, yes, I can easily afford that, I lied reassuringly. He could not disguise his glee. Good boy, he cheered. We're going to have a ball. I tried to ask him some general questions about the old man. He forcefully cut me off. Save all this for the man himself. It'll be all yours, he said, smiling. He began to tell me then about his life in the United States and about his business aspirations. And to my utter bewilderment, since I'd already classified him as a phony who didn't speak a word of English, he shifted into English. You do speak English, I exclaimed without any attempt at hiding my surprise. Of course I do, my boy, he said, affecting a Texan accent, which he carried on for the duration of our conversation. I told you, I wanted to test you to see if you're resourceful. You are. In fact, you are quite clever, I may say. His command of English was superb, and he delighted me with jokes and stories. In no time at all, we were in Potam. He directed me to a house on the outskirts of town. We got out of the car. He led the way, calling loudly in Spanish for Lucas Coronado. We heard a voice in the back of the house that said, also in Spanish, Come over here. There was a man behind a small shack sitting on the ground on a goatskin. He was holding a piece of wood with his bare feet while he worked on it with a chisel and a mallet. By holding the piece of wood in place with the pressure of his feet, he had fashioned a stupendous potter's turning wheel, so to speak. His feet turned the piece as his hands worked the chisel. I'd never seen anything like this in my life. He was making a mask, hollowing it with a curved chisel. His control of his feet and holding the wood and turning it around was remarkable. The man was very thin. He had a thin face with angular features, high cheekbones, and a dark copperish complexion. The skin of his face and neck seemed to be stretched to the maximum. He sported a thin, droopy mustache that gave his angular face a malevolent slant. He had an aquiline nose, a very thin bridge, and fierce black eyes. His extremely black eyebrows appeared as if they'd been drawn on with a pencil, and so did his jet-black hair combed backward on his head. I had never seen a more hostile face. The image that came to mind looking at him was that of an Italian poisoner of the era of the Medicis. The words truculent and saturnine seemed to be the most apt descriptions when I focused my attention on Lucas Coronado's face. I noticed that while he was sitting on the ground, holding the piece of wood with his feet, the bones of his legs were so long that his knees came to his shoulders. When we approached him, he stopped working and stood up. He was taller than Jorge Campos, and as thin as a rail. As a gesture of deference to us, I suppose, he put on his huaraches. Come in, he said, without smiling. I had a strange feeling then that Lucas Coronado didn't know how to smile. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? He asked Jorge Campos. I've brought you this young man here because he wants to ask you some questions about your art, Jorge Campos said in a most patronizing tone. I vouched that you would answer his questions truthfully. Oh, that's no problem, Lucas Coronado assured me, sizing me up with his cold stare. He shifted into a different language then, which I presumed to be Yaqui. He and Jorge Campos got into an animated conversation that lasted for some time. Both of them acted as if I didn't exist. Then, Jorge Campos turned to me. We have a little problem here, he said. Lucas has just informed me that this is a very busy season for him since the festivities are approaching, so he won't be able to answer all the questions that you ask him, but he will at another time. Yes, most certainly, Lucas Coronado said to me in Spanish. At another time, indeed, at another time. We have to cut our visit short, Jorge Campos said, but I'll bring you back again. As we were leaving, I felt moved to express to Lucas Coronado my admiration for his stupendous technique of working with his hands and feet. He looked at me as if I were mad, his eyes widening with surprise. You've never seen anyone working on a mask? He hissed through clenched teeth. Where are you from, Mars? I felt stupid. I tried to explain that his technique was quite new to me. He seemed ready to hit me on the head. Jorge Campos said to me in English that I had offended Lucas Coronado with my comment. He'd understood my praise as a veiled way of making fun of his poverty. My words had been to him an ironic statement of how poor and helpless he was. But it's the opposite, I said. I think he's magnificent. Don't try to tell him anything like that, Jorge Campos retorted. These people are trained to receive and dispense insults in a most covert form. He thinks it's odd that you run him down when you don't even know him and make fun of the fact that he cannot afford a vice to hold his sculpture. I felt totally at a loss. The last thing I wanted was to foul up my only possible content. Jorge Campos seemed to be utterly aware of my chagrin. Buy one of his masks, he advised me. I told him that I intended to drive to Los Angeles in one lap without stopping, and that I had just sufficient money to buy gasoline and food. Well, give him your leather jacket, he said matter-of-factly, but in a confidential, helpful tone. Otherwise, you're going to anger him, and all he'll remember about you will be your insults. But don't tell him that his masks are beautiful. Just buy one. When I told Lucas Coronado that I wanted to trade my leather jacket for one of his masks, he grinned with satisfaction. He took the jacket and put it on. He walked to his house, but before he entered, he did some strange gyrations. He knelt in front of some sort of religious altar and moved his arms as if to stretch them and rubbed his hands on the sides of the jacket. He went inside the house and brought out a bundle wrapped in newspapers, which he handed to me. I wanted to ask him some questions. He excused himself, saying that he had to work.